I opened the door after an exhausting 11-hour shift, only to find 6 of my husband's relatives occupying my living room as if they lived there. I smiled, set my bag down, walked straight into my bedroom, and did not cook a single dish. None of them realized that in less than 1 month, the dinner they expected me to serve would become the exact trap that collapsed their entire family system right in front of them. My name is Chloe Allen, and I am 37 years old. The exhaustion settling into my bones was not just physical, it was a deep, structural fatigue that came from spending 11 solid hours analyzing collateral risk at Briarfield Risk and Lending Solutions. Greystone, North Carolina, is a city built on old money and new debt, and my job was to sort the former from the latter. I was exceptionally good at it. I understood numbers, contracts, and the cold, hard reality of leverage. What I apparently did not understand, until this very evening, was the leverage being used against me in my own life. The drive home had been a blur of blinding headlights and freezing rain. All I wanted was the quiet sanctuary of the townhouse I had purchased 3 years before I even met my husband. It was my house. The deed, the mortgage, the property taxes all meticulously paid and managed under my name, from my personal accounts. It was the one place in the world where I controlled the variables, the one environment where the chaos of the outside world was not permitted to enter without my explicit consent. I turned my key in the front door, the heavy deadbolt sliding back with a satisfying, metallic thunk. I pushed the door open, expecting the familiar, comforting silence, the faint scent of my lavender reed diffusers, and the dim, welcoming glow of the hallway sconces. Instead, I was hit by a physical wall of heat, loud, overlapping voices, and the overwhelming scent of cheap floral perfume mixed with damp wool. I stopped dead in the entryway. My living room was completely occupied. 6 of my husband's relatives were draped across my furniture like they had been living there for a decade. Heavy winter coats were carelessly thrown over the backs of my pale linen dining chairs. Wet boots were piled haphazardly on the hardwood floor, entirely missing the rubber mat I kept by the door specifically for that purpose. In the kitchen, Aunt Brenda Pike was systematically opening and closing my upper cabinets. The sharp clatter of wood hitting wood echoed through the open floor plan. She did not even flinch when I walked in. She simply paused, her hand hovering over a shelf of my expensive glassware, and looked at me with an expression of mild impatience. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of the scene unfolding in front of me, my mother-in-law, Lorraine Harlan, leaned forward from her comfortable spot on my custom sofa. She held a glass of my red wine in her right hand. "Got anything quick to eat, honey?" Lorraine asked. Her tone was casual, laced with a familiar, demanding edge. She looked at me not like a homeowner returning after an 11-hour workday, but like a tardy servant who had kept the lords of the manor waiting for their evening meal. My eyes cut to the center of the room. My husband, Ryan Harlan, was sitting in the armchair, flanked by his brother and a cousin. Ryan possessed the kind of easy, effortless charm that allowed him to glide through life without ever taking true responsibility for the messes he created. He saw the shift in my posture. He saw the tension lock my jaw. Ryan stood up, plastering on his signature placating smile, the exact smile he always used to smooth things over before dealing with the actual consequences of his actions. He walked toward me, hands raised slightly in a gesture of fake surrender. "Hey, babe," Ryan said, his voice dripping with forced lightness. "Just a small, surprise family dinner. Nothing crazy. A surprise family dinner. On a random Tuesday, with 6 people, in my house, while I was at work, the old Chloe, the woman from 6 months ago, or even 6 weeks ago, would have snapped. I would have dropped my bag, crossed my arms, and demanded to know what was going on. I would have argued about boundaries and respect. I would have eventually cooked the dinner while seething with quiet resentment, allowing them to eat my food while I swallowed my anger. That was the established dynamic. They pushed. I fought back just enough to look unreasonable, and then I caved to keep the peace. They were all watching me now. Brenda closed the cabinet door. Lorraine took another slow sip of wine. Ryan held his breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion so he could immediately play the victim of his high-strung, unaccommodating wife. I looked at Ryan. I looked at Lorraine. I looked at the wet coats dripping onto my chairs. I smiled. It was a completely empty, perfectly polite social smile, a hollow curving of the lips that reached absolutely nowhere near my eyes. "Hello, everyone," I said, my voice perfectly level and smooth. "Make yourselves comfortable." I did not argue. I did not question them. I did not walk into the kitchen to assess the pantry. I simply shifted my leather tote bag higher on my shoulder, stepped neatly around Ryan, and walked directly down the hallway toward the master suite. I stepped inside and shut the door behind me. I reached out and turned the brass thumb turn of the lock. The sharp click sounded like a gunshot in the sudden quiet of the bedroom. I dropped my bag on the floor. The adrenaline that usually accompanied these ambushes was entirely gone, replaced by a freezing, hyper-focused clarity. I stripped off my work clothes, peeling away the stiff blazer and the restrictive pencil skirt, and pulled on a soft pair of sweatpants and an oversized cashmere sweater. I picked up my phone. I opened a delivery application. I did not order a family feast. I ordered one single portion of spicy Thai basil chicken from a restaurant on the exact opposite side of Greystone. I paid with my own credit card. Then, I walked over to my desk, opened my laptop, and created a new, blank document. I typed the date. I typed the exact time of my arrival. I typed the names of every single person sitting in my living room: Lorraine, Brenda, Ryan, the brother, the cousin, the uncle, 6 invaders. A soft knock sounded at the bedroom door. The handle jiggled, then stopped abruptly, defeated by the heavy lock. "Chloe," Ryan whispered loudly through the wood. "Open the door. Come on." I stood up, walked to the door, and unlocked it, pulling it open just a few inches. Ryan stood there in the hallway, his placating smile entirely gone, replaced by an expression of panicked annoyance. "What are you doing?" he hissed, glancing back nervously over his shoulder toward the living room. "Don't make things awkward. Chloe, they are hungry. You are embarrassing me in front of my family." I looked at his face. I studied the defensive set of his jaw and the shifting, cowardly avoidance in his eyes. "I have exactly one question for you. Ryan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet completely devoid of warmth. "When did you tell me they were coming?" Ryan shifted his weight from his left foot to his right. He looked at the floorboard, then back at me. He knew the rules of the game were changing, but he did not know how to play this new version. "This afternoon," Ryan finally admitted, muttering the words like a petulant child caught in a lie. "You told me this afternoon," I asked, raising one eyebrow. "Well, I meant to," he amended quickly, his voice rising in defensive panic. "Things got busy at the office, but it is just dinner, Chloe." "It is not a big deal." "I see," I replied. I closed the door directly in his face. I turned the lock again. I walked over to my bed and sat down on the edge of the mattress. Through the drywall, I could hear the muffled sounds of the Harlan family realizing they had to fend for themselves. I heard the clanging of my heavy copper pots. I heard the scrape of my dining chairs being dragged across the floor. I heard the low, irritated murmur of Lorraine's voice complaining bitterly about my absence. Let them complain. Let them bang the pots and search the pantry. Let them think they had won this minor battle of wills. Sitting there in the dim light of my bedroom, listening to the blatant invasion of my sanctuary, I made a final, unbreakable decision. My silence tonight was not submission. I was not retreating because I was defeated or overwhelmed. I was retreating to build my case. I was a risk analyst. I spent my days tearing apart bad investments, exposing hidden liabilities, and dismantling structural failures. Ryan and his family thought I was just a difficult wife throwing a silent tantrum over groceries. They had absolutely no idea that as of this very second, I was no longer looking at them as family. I was looking at them as a hostile takeover, and I was going to audit every single one of them. 2 years ago, my life was a masterpiece of my own meticulous design. I had spent my late 20s and early 30s ruthlessly focused on a singular goal of financial and personal independence. I lived far below my means, saving 20% of every paycheck I ever earned. I maintained a flawless credit score. When I finally closed on the townhouse, it was the proudest achievement of my life. It was a beautiful modern space with dark hardwood floors, white marble countertops, and a quiet, fenced backyard. More importantly, it was entirely mine. The down payment, the mortgage, the property taxes, and the insurance were all paid from my personal accounts. It was physical proof of my autonomy, a fortress where I controlled every variable. Then came Ryan. When we first met, he seemed like the perfect counterweight to my highly structured corporate reality. He worked as an operations manager for his family's property and hospitality business. He was funny, grounded, and possessed a warm, easygoing energy. He spoke highly of his parents and his brother, portraying a close-knit clan that valued tradition. Yet, he maintained his own apartment across town and seemed to respect the concept of personal space. I truly believed I had found the holy grail of modern dating, a man who loved his family but still operated as an independent adult. After our wedding, Ryan packed up his rented apartment and moved into my townhouse. For the first 6 months, our living arrangement was flawless. The Harlan family was welcoming but polite. If his mother, Lorraine, or his aunt, Brenda, wanted to drop by, they called a minimum of 48 hours in advance. They would come over for a Sunday brunch, compliment the landscaping, drink a cup of coffee, and leave after exactly 2 hours. It felt normal. It felt respectful. It felt like the healthy merging of two lives. But boundaries do not collapse suddenly in a dramatic explosion. They wash away in a slow, almost imperceptible erosion. It started with small, seemingly harmless exceptions. Tyler, Ryan's younger brother, stopped by unannounced on a Tuesday morning to grab a tool from Ryan. Then it was Aunt Brenda swinging by on a Thursday afternoon to drop off some extra vegetables from her garden, deciding to invite herself in for a glass of water, and then lingering on my sofa until dinner time. Within 10 months, my quiet townhouse had unofficially transformed into the Harlan family headquarters. The erosion accelerated until the original landscape of my life was unrecognizable. My attached 2-car garage gradually became the designated free storage unit for Tyler's seasonal sports equipment and Lorraine's discarded antique furniture. My carefully curated refrigerator was constantly stuffed with half-empty containers of heavy, greasy casseroles and brands of cheap beer I would never touch. They stopped ringing the doorbell entirely. Instead, they started using the spare garage keypad code that Ryan had foolishly given his mother for a hypothetical emergency that had never actually occurred. I did not scream. I did not throw plates. I approached the escalating issue exactly how I approached a misaligned risk portfolio at the lending firm. I sat Ryan down at our kitchen island on a quiet Sunday night. I kept my tone perfectly even and my words highly specific. I did not hurl insults at his mother or his brother. I simply explained that while I respected his family, I required a sanctuary. I needed a simple text message before people appeared in my living room. I needed our weekends to not feel like an ongoing, unhosted open house. Ryan delivered the exact same performance every single time we had this conversation. He would look deeply concerned, nod his head sympathetically, and reach across the marble counter to hold my hand. He would look into my eyes and say he completely understood my frustration. He would solemnly promise to have a firm, decisive talk with his family the very next morning. He assured me he would establish the boundaries and protect our privacy. He never did. Or, if he did actually speak to them, he delivered the message with such cowardly hesitation that his family immediately dismissed it. Worse, my perfectly reasonable requests for basic privacy were somehow twisted and weaponized against me during their family group chats and holiday gatherings. Because I did not eagerly embrace a house full of loud, uninvited guests treating my living room like a public transit lounge, a new narrative was meticulously crafted. I became the villain. I was branded the cold, corporate wife. I was the uptight, unwelcoming daughter-in-law who simply did not understand how real, loving families operated. Lorraine began making passive-aggressive comments about my rigid schedule and my career obsession. Brenda would loudly joke to the rest of the room that they all had to walk on eggshells so they would not disturb the Ice Queen in her expensive castle. Whenever these thinly veiled insults were thrown across my own dining table, I would instinctively look at Ryan, waiting for him to step up. I waited for him to firmly state that the rules of the house were a joint decision. Instead, Ryan would just stare down at his plate, chuckle nervously, and quickly change the subject to sports or weather. He actively chose the comfort of appeasing his overbearing mother over the fundamental duty of standing by his wife. He hated conflict, and because I was the reasonable one who would not cause a public scene, he always chose to let me absorb the disrespect. So, I adapted. But my adaptation was a silent, devastating retreat. I began shrinking my own existence to accommodate their sprawling, entitled presence. I started waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning just to enjoy one single hour of silence with my coffee, before Ryan woke up and the inevitable daily barrage of text messages from his relatives began pinging on his phone. Instead of leaving the financial office at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I started volunteering for complex, late-stage underwriting projects. I would purposely stay at my desk until 7 or 8 o'clock at night just to avoid the evening rush hour at my own house. On the days I did leave on time, I would sometimes pull into a random grocery store parking lot and just sit behind the steering wheel for 45 minutes. I would stare blankly at the windshield, my stomach tying itself into knots, actively dreading the moment I had to turn the key in my own front door and face whoever was lounging on my furniture. I stopped buying the expensive sparkling water I loved because Tyler would casually drink 6 cans in a single afternoon and never replace them. I stopped leaving my sensitive work documents on the home office desk because Lorraine would shuffle them into messy piles to make room for her knitting magazines. I systematically erased my own footprint in my own home to avoid the friction of existing alongside them. It was a quiet, pathetic tragedy. I was transferring a substantial mortgage payment from my bank account on the first day of every single month. I was paying the property taxes, the electricity, the water, and the internet. Yet, I was living like an unwanted ghost haunting someone else's property. The realization hit me with a sickening, heavy weight. I no longer had a home. I had essentially funded a very expensive, beautifully decorated waiting room where other people entirely dictated the schedule, the noise level, and the rules of engagement. The muffled clatter of silverware against ceramic plates seeped through the drywall of my bedroom. For over 2 hours, I sat in the dim light, eating my delivery food in absolute silence. The atmosphere on the other side of the door was thick with an awkward, heavy tension. I could hear the forced, overly loud laughter of Tyler trying to fill the void, followed by the sharp, irritated sighs of Lorraine. They were fending for themselves, ordering lukewarm pizzas and scrounging through my pantry, profoundly offended that the woman of the house had refused to step into the kitchen and play her assigned role. Around 9:45, the heavy oak front door finally clicked shut. The sudden silence that fell over the house was deafening. A few seconds later, heavy, purposeful footsteps marched down the hallway. The bedroom door swung open. Ryan stood in the frame, his shoulders rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles twitched under his skin. He did not yell. He never yelled. His brand of anger was a suppressed, suffocating pressure, designed to make me feel entirely responsible for his emotional discomfort. "That was incredibly disrespectful," Ryan said, his voice dropping into a harsh, vibrating whisper. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "You completely humiliated me in front of my entire family." I placed my empty food container into the small wastebasket under my desk. I stood up and faced him, my expression completely neutral. "I humiliated you?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "Yes," he hissed, pacing a tight circle at the foot of the bed. "You hid in here like a petulant teenager. They came over for a nice family evening, and you could not even be bothered to come out and say hello properly. You made them feel like unwanted intruders." "They were unwanted intruders, Ryan," I replied smoothly. "I did not invite them," I did not know they were coming until I walked through the front door after an 11-hour shift. "It is just dinner," he countered, throwing his hands up in a gesture of profound exasperation. "Why do you always have to make everything into a massive issue? You just need to be more flexible. Normal families drop by. Normal people roll with the punches." I refused to take the bait. I refused to argue about the pizza, the unwashed dishes currently sitting in my sink, or my obligations as a hostess. I bypassed the emotional noise and targeted the structural flaw of his argument. "This has absolutely nothing to do with flexibility," I said, my voice dropping an octave, forcing him to stop pacing and actually listen. "This is about basic, fundamental consent. You do not have the right to unilaterally offer up my living space to 6 people without my prior knowledge. You do not get to dictate the use of this house while completely bypassing me as a co-decision maker. This is about the control of my environment." Ryan stared at me. He opened his mouth to argue, but the cold, clinical precision of my words seemed to temporarily short-circuit his usual defensive tactics. He shook his head, let out a long, bitter breath, and walked into the adjoining bathroom, firmly shutting the door. The argument was over, but nothing had been resolved. The next morning, I woke up at 5:30. Ryan was still asleep, his back turned to me. I made my coffee in the quiet kitchen, staring at the grease stains left on my stove from whatever they had reheated the night before. I did not clean it. Instead, I picked up my phone. I needed to establish a documented perimeter. I drafted a text message to Ryan. I deleted every single word that sounded emotional, accusatory, or angry. I stripped the message down to its absolute, bare framework. "Good morning. To avoid any future misunderstandings regarding the house, we need a clear system. From this day forward, any guests coming to the house must be announced at least 24 hours in advance, and their visit must be explicitly agreed upon by both of us. If I am not consulted, the house is not available. Have a good day at work." I hit send at exactly 7 o'clock. 16 minutes later, my screen illuminated with his reply. It was a single, 2-letter word. Okay. It was too fast. It was too easy. The Ryan I knew would usually write a long, meandering paragraph about how I was being too rigid, but that he would try his best. The instant, compliant agreement felt hollow. My suspicions were validated less than 8 hours later. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I was sitting at my desk at the financial firm, reviewing a commercial loan application, when my phone vibrated on the polished wood surface. It was a notification from the Harlan family group chat, a channel I usually kept on permanent mute, but occasionally checked for logistical reasons. I tapped the screen. The message was from Lorraine. "Hey everyone. Tyler is bringing his famous dip, and Brenda is making the roast. See you all at Ryan's place on Saturday night around 6 o'clock. So excited for a proper catch-up." I stared at the glowing pixels. Saturday night. 4 days from now. I scrolled up slightly. There was no preceding message from Ryan telling them that Saturday did not work. There was no mention of asking me. The tone of Lorraine's message was entirely declarative. It was not a request. It was a scheduled deployment. The realization washed over me, cold and absolute. Ryan had not said a single word to his family about the boundary we had supposedly established that morning. Or, if he had spoken to them, he had presented it as a minor, easily ignored suggestion from his difficult wife, rather than a firm rule for the household. His quick text to me was nothing but a pacifier, designed to shut me up while he continued to operate behind my back. He thought I would just sigh, complain a little, and ultimately accept the Saturday dinner because the plans were already in motion. He was relying on my social conditioning to avoid making a scene. I did not reply to the group chat. I did not text Ryan to demand an explanation. The era of demanding explanations was officially over. I minimized my company's risk assessment software on my monitor. I opened my personal laptop, which sat on the corner of my desk. I navigated to my encrypted personal drive. I right-clicked the mouse, selected the option to create a new, blank document, and saved it under a highly unremarkable, perfectly neutral title, House Timeline. I opened the blank page. I typed the current date. Below it, I typed the events of the previous evening, noting the exact arrival time of the 6 relatives. I took a screenshot of the brief text exchange between Ryan and me from that morning and pasted the image directly into the document. Finally, I took a screenshot of Lorraine's group chat message, pasting it right below Ryan's empty promise. I stared at the screen. The anger that had been simmering in my chest for months completely evaporated, leaving behind something much colder and far more dangerous. I was no longer an exhausted wife fighting for a quiet evening. I was an auditor, and I had just opened a formal case file on my own marriage. The rest of the work week passed with an eerie, manufactured calmness. Ryan executed a sudden, drastic shift in his behavior. On Wednesday evening, I came home to find the kitchen completely spotless. The lingering grease stains from his family's chaotic meal were scrubbed away. The dishwasher hummed quietly. On the granite counter sat a white bakery box containing the expensive lemon tart I loved from a downtown patisserie. He kissed my cheek, poured me a glass of chilled white wine, and asked about my day with exaggerated interest. It was a performance, a perfectly executed simulation of a supportive husband trying to patch the cracks in a strained marriage. Thursday night. He casually leaned against the door frame of my study. He announced that he had spoken to his mother. He proudly declared that the large family gathering planned for Saturday was officially canceled. He insisted we needed a quiet, private weekend, just the two of us, to reconnect and decompress. I nodded. I smiled. I thanked him for prioritizing our time. Internally, every single alarm bell in my nervous system was ringing. Ryan did not cancel events with Lorraine unless he was playing a much longer game. I accepted the olive branch, but my grip on the handle was tight. I remained hypervigilant, watching his every move through the lens of a silent auditor. The first tangible piece of evidence arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I pulled into the driveway after work, retrieved the stack of mail from the metal box by the curb, and began sorting through the envelopes while walking up the front path. Bills, local grocery advertisements, a thick catalog. Then, my thumb stopped on a crisp, heavy-stock white envelope. The return address belonged to a corporate tax preparation firm in the city. The recipient block, however, made me freeze on the porch. It read, Harlan Hospitality Group, LLC. Directly beneath that corporate name was my exact home address, my street, my house number, my zip code. I had never heard of this entity in my life. I walked inside, dropped my keys on the console table, and found Ryan on the sofa watching a basketball game. I held the envelope out, letting it hover directly in his line of sight. I kept my voice light, masking the sharp edge of my suspicion. I asked him why a corporate tax document for a company I did not recognize was being mailed to my private residence. Ryan barely glanced up from the television screen. He waved his hand dismissively. He claimed it was just some temporary paperwork for a new side project his father was launching. He said they needed a quick mailing address for the initial registration because the main office mailroom was being renovated, so he just used ours for convenience. He promised it was absolutely nothing serious. I stared at the side of his face for 3 long seconds. I dropped the envelope on his lap and walked away. I knew a lie when I heard one. 2 days later, Aunt Brenda actually texted ahead of time to ask if she could drop off a houseplant. It was a clear attempt to show me they were following my new rules. I allowed it. I was in the living room answering emails on my laptop when I heard the distinct, artificial shutter click of a smartphone camera coming from the kitchen. I stood up silently and walked down the hallway. Brenda was standing in the corner of my dining room. She was not taking selfies. She was not photographing the new plant. She was holding her phone horizontally, capturing wide, panoramic shots of my custom marble island, the expensive stainless steel appliances, and the open flow into the dining area. There were no people in the frame. It looked exactly like a staging photo for a commercial real estate listing. When I cleared my throat, she jumped, quickly lowering her phone. She offered a high-pitched, nervous laugh, claiming she just loved how I decorated the space and wanted inspiration for her own upcoming kitchen remodel. I smiled warmly. agreed that the lighting was fantastic, and watched her hurry out the front door 10 minutes later. The pieces were floating in the air, disjointed but heavy with implication. The final catalyst occurred on a Friday morning. I was supposed to be at the office by 8 o'clock, but a sudden system outage at the firm allowed me to work from home for the first 2 hours of the day. Ryan thought I was in the shower. I was actually standing in the walk-in closet, fully dressed, reaching for a pair of shoes, when I heard his voice bleeding through the air vent that connected to his home office downstairs. The acoustics of the vent carried his words with crystalline clarity. He was speaking rapidly, his tone a mix of frustration and pleading. He was talking to his brother, Tyler. I held my breath, pressing my shoulder against the wall. Then, I heard the sentence that shattered the remaining illusions of my marriage. Ryan lowered his voice and practically begged his brother to just be patient. He said that if she just sits down at the table and signs, the whole thing is done in 15 minutes. In 15 minutes. The blood roaring in my ears was deafening. I walked out of the closet, stepped heavily down the wooden stairs to ensure he heard me coming, and pushed open the door to his office. Ryan jumped, nearly dropping his phone. He quickly tapped the screen, ending the call abruptly. I leaned against the doorframe. Crossing my arms, I asked him, very calmly, what exactly needed to be signed in 15 minutes. The pleasant, accommodating husband from the past week instantly vanished. His posture grew rigid. His eyes darted toward the window. He snapped at me, his voice tight with defensive irritation, claiming it was just boring work stuff regarding a vendor contract. He brushed past me, muttering about being late for a site visit, and practically ran out the front door. I stood alone in the hallway, listening to the engine of his car roar to life and fade down the street. The initial shock quickly hardened into a cold, unbreakable resolve. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together, the unannounced dinner with 6 relatives, the sudden appeasement, the mysterious mail, the wide-angle photographs of my kitchen, the desperate phone call about signing documents. That first dinner was never about a casual family gathering. It was a calculated, theatrical setup. It was a pressure test. They were trying to soften me up, gauge my compliance, and prepare the ground for a massive financial ask. I did not cry. I did not panic. I walked directly to my desk and opened my laptop. I pulled up the encrypted document labeled House Timeline. I added the new dates, the excuse about the mail, Brenda's photography session, and the exact quotation I had overheard through the vent. Then, I opened a new browser window. I bypassed my usual financial risk software and navigated straight to the official website of the North Carolina Secretary of State. I clicked on the Public Business Registration search portal. My fingers flew across the keyboard with the practiced rhythm of a professional auditor. I typed the name of the mysterious company from the envelope. I was no longer waiting for the truth to be handed to me wrapped in a comfortable lie. I was going to rip it out of the public record, line by line, and prepare for the exact moment I would burn his fragile, deceitful little plan to the ground. I sat at my desk, the glow of the monitor illuminating the quiet room. The North Carolina Secretary of State website is a remarkably efficient tool if you know exactly what you are looking for. I typed the name from the envelope into the corporate search bar and hit enter. A single result populated on the screen. I clicked the hyperlink to open the public filing history. There, in black and white, were the articles of organization for Harlan Hospitality Group, a limited liability company. I scrolled down to Section 3. The date of incorporation was exactly 4 months ago. 4 months. That was the exact same time Ryan had suddenly suggested we start hosting his parents for Sunday dinners more regularly. I moved to the registered agent section. The name listed was Ryan Harlan. The registered office address and the principal place of business were both identical. It was my address, my townhouse. The property I bought with my own money. The nausea that had been threatening to surface was pushed down by a wave of cold, professional detachment. I was no longer a wife discovering a betrayal. I was an underwriter examining a fraudulent application. I continued reading the document. Under the section detailing the nature of the business, the language was deliberately opaque. It described the enterprise as engaging in executive staging, client hosting, and strategic administrative operations. It was a perfectly vague corporate word salad that practically screamed their intention to use my pristine, upscale home as a free showroom to impress potential investors or clients. I needed more data. I minimized the browser window and opened our shared household email account, a generic address we use strictly for utility bills and streaming service subscriptions. I bypassed the inbox and went straight to the trash folder, then the archive. I utilized the search function. Typing in keywords I dealt with every single day at the firm application: inquiry, term sheet, collateral. A hit surfaced from 2 weeks ago. It was an automated notification from a mid-sized commercial lending institution based in Charlotte. The subject line read, "Action required regarding your commercial bridge loan inquiry." I opened the email. It was a follow-up message addressed to Ryan, requesting additional documentation to proceed with what they termed a collateral discussion. They were looking for a hard asset to secure a short-term injection of capital. I opened my encrypted timeline document and began cross-referencing the dates. I plotted the formation of the shell company. I mapped the dates of the lender emails. Then, I overlaid the frequency of the Harlan family visits. The pattern was undeniable. The sudden spike in unannounced dinners, the lingering relatives, the attempts to normalize their constant presence in my space, it all aligned perfectly with a severe cash flow crisis in their primary family business. They were heavily over-leveraged on a new commercial development downtown, and the market had cooled. They needed cash, they needed a loan, and they needed a clean, unencumbered asset to secure it. My house was the asset. The dinners were the psychological softening campaign. As I typed the final notes into my timeline, my phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text message. Not from Ryan, not from Lorraine, but from Megan. Megan was Tyler's wife, a quiet, observant woman who usually stayed on the periphery of the family drama. I opened the message. "Hey, Chloe. I just wanted to reach out privately and apologize for how tense things have been lately. I feel awful about the other night. Honestly, I thought you had already agreed to let Ryan use the house for a few months to host those prospective clients and sign the restructuring paperwork. Ryan told us all last month that you knew everything and were totally on board, but that you were just acting a bit distant because you were stressed from your corporate job. I am so sorry if we overstepped." I read the text 3 times to ensure I was fully absorbing the magnitude of the lie. Ryan had not just kept me in the dark, he had actively weaponized my exhaustion. He had taken my silence, my desperate attempts to avoid conflict after 11-hour workdays, and sold it to his family as silent consent. He painted me as a supportive but stressed wife who had graciously offered up her largest financial asset to save the family empire. This explained everything. It explained Lorraine's entitled attitude in my kitchen. It explained Brenda taking staging photographs of my dining room. It explained why Tyler thought it was perfectly acceptable to treat my home like a corporate clubhouse. They genuinely believed I was a willing participant in this scheme. The urge to march downstairs, grab Ryan by the collar, and scream until my throat bled was incredibly strong. But screaming was a tactic for the powerless. Screaming gave the opponent an opportunity to deflect, to call you crazy, to twist the narrative. I dealt with numbers and contracts. Numbers do not scream. They simply prove you wrong. I took a deep breath, steadying my hands. I typed a brief, measured reply to Megan. "Thank you for telling me. Megan, I appreciate your honesty more than you know. Please do not worry about it. And please keep this conversation between us for now." I watched the delivery confirmation appear. Then, I picked up my phone and opened my contacts. I scrolled past my friends, past my coworkers, and stopped at a number my father had given me years ago. It belonged to a senior partner at a highly respected property and family law firm in the city. I tapped the number. A receptionist answered on the second ring. I kept my voice calm and authoritative. I requested the earliest possible consultation regarding a complex marital asset protection issue. She offered me an appointment for the following Tuesday at 10 o'clock in the morning. I accepted, wrote the confirmation number down on a legal pad, and disconnected the call. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair. staring up at the ceiling. The isolation was profound, but it was no longer terrifying. It was empowering. I realized in that quiet moment that I was not just dealing with a deceitful husband. I was up against an entire family mechanism, a machine that ran on collective pressure, unspoken obligations, and the absolute expectation that women like me would eventually fold to keep the peace. Ryan thought he could isolate me in my own home, surround me with his relatives, and wear me down until signing a piece of paper felt easier than fighting. He was fundamentally wrong. I was not going to ask him another question. I was not going to demand another explanation. From this moment forward, I would only speak when I had every single document, every single timeline, and every single legal maneuver securely in place. They wanted to treat my home like a business transaction. I was about to show them exactly how a professional closes a deal. I waited until Sunday evening. The house was quiet, the fading twilight casting long, sharp shadows across the hardwood floors of the dining room. I sat at the head of the long oak table, a position usually reserved for a host, but tonight it was the seat of an interrogator. In front of me sat a neat, perfectly aligned stack of 3 printed documents. Ryan came downstairs around 7 o'clock, wearing a faded college sweatshirt and holding an empty water glass. He paused when he saw me, his casual demeanor instantly evaporating. The air in the room was heavy, suffocating under the weight of what was about to happen. "Sit down, Ryan," I said. My voice was completely devoid of emotion. It was the exact tone I used when informing a client that their risk profile was unacceptable. He frowned, gripping the glass tightly. But he pulled out a chair opposite me and sat. "What is going on? You look incredibly serious." I slid the first piece of paper across the smooth wood. It was the public registration for Harlan Hospitality Group, a limited liability company, clearly showing my residential address as its principal place of operation. "Explain this," I said. Ryan glanced at the paper. A flash of genuine panic crossed his eyes, but he quickly masked it with an exasperated sigh. "Chloe, we talked about this. It is just a temporary mailing address for my dad. It is nothing." I slid the second piece of paper over the first. It was a printed copy of the commercial lending inquiry, complete with the bank's request for collateral discussion. "Do not lie to me again," I said, my voice dropping lower, cutting through the quiet room like a scalpel. "I am an underwriter. I know exactly what a commercial bridge loan requires. I know what collateral means in this context." He stared at the documents, his jaw tightening. The deflection phase was over. He realized he could not charm his way out of hard data. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands over his face, heavily transitioning into his next tactic, playing the victim of a family crisis. "Things are bad, Chloe," Ryan began, his voice taking on a pleading, desperate quality. "The commercial development project downtown is completely stalled. The supply chain issues drained our cash reserves, and the primary lender is threatening to call the original note. My parents are terrified. The entire family business is on the verge of bankruptcy." I sat perfectly still. "And what does their bankruptcy have to do with the deed to my townhouse?" Ryan leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table, trying to project earnestness. "We just need a temporary bridge loan to get us through the next 6 months until the downtown project opens and generates revenue. The bank needs an unencumbered asset to secure the funds. We just need to use the equity in this house. It is just on paper. Chloe, it is a temporary hold." He was asking me to risk the single largest financial asset I owned, the house I bought with my own blood, sweat, and savings, to bail out his father's mismanaged company. "You want me to guarantee a commercial loan for a failing business with my premarital property," I stated, stripping away his soft corporate jargon. "You are my wife," Ryan said, his voice rising, thick with a sickening blend of entitlement and desperation. "This is your family now. This is your future too. When the company recovers, we will all benefit. We are supposed to be a team." The sheer audacity of the statement hung in the air. He was implicitly declaring that my independent success was nothing more than a contingency fund for his family's failures. I kept my hands folded neatly on my lap to hide the slight tremor of pure rage traveling up my arms. "Did you ask me?" I asked, enunciating every single syllable. "Before you told your mother, before you told Tyler, before you let Megan believe I had already agreed to this arrangement, did you ever actually ask me if I was willing to do this?" The room fell utterly silent. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Ryan looked down at his hands. He could not meet my eyes. The silence stretched for 10 agonizing seconds. "I thought you would understand," he finally whispered, looking at the wood grain of the table. "I thought you would see that they were hurting and just step up. If I asked you outright, I knew you would overanalyze it and say no. So you decided to manipulate me instead," I replied. The truth finally laid bare under the harsh dining room lights. Then, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, chilling me to the bone. "That first night," I said, my mind racing backward to the evening I came home from a grueling 11-hour shift. The night 6 of them were sitting in my living room. There was no surprise family dinner. That was a setup, was it not? Ryan swallowed hard, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed red. "It was just to make talking easier," he admitted, his voice defensive. "My mom thought that if everyone was here, showing a united front, showing how much we needed you, you would feel the love and support and not make it a huge, clinical issue. We just wanted to soften the blow. A unified front. An ambush. They brought 6 people into my sanctuary to create an overwhelming wall of psychological pressure, hoping I would be too exhausted and too polite to refuse them in my own living room. They had weaponized the concept of family to orchestrate a financial shakedown. I stood up slowly. I gathered the 3 pieces of paper, tapping their edges against the table to align them perfectly. "I am not signing a single document," I said, looking down at the man I had married, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical disgust. "I am not offering my home as collateral for your family's debt, and you have exactly until 5 o'clock on Friday to legally remove this address from your corporate registry, or I will file an injunction." Ryan stood up, kicking his chair back so violently it nearly toppled over. The mask of the pleading husband shattered completely, revealing the deeply ingrained resentment beneath. "You are unbelievable," he spat, pointing a shaking finger at me. "My family is losing everything, and all you care about is your name on a piece of paper. You have no heart, Chloe. You always turn every single human interaction into a cold, calculated transaction." He turned around and stormed out of the dining room. I heard him grab his car keys from the console table. The heavy oak front door slammed shut with such force that the windows rattled in their frames. A moment later, tires screeched against the asphalt of the driveway. I stood alone in the quiet dining room. He thought his parting insult would wound me. He thought calling me transactional would make me feel guilty for lacking empathy. He was entirely wrong. It was not an insult. It was a profound realization. This was never a communication issue. It was not a matter of a husband being insensitive to his wife's need for personal space. Ryan had actively, consciously cornered me. He had leveraged his entire family against my mental health and my financial security. He had viewed my independence as a threat until he realized it could be used as a resource. I walked over to the windows and pulled the heavy linen curtains shut, blocking out the streetlights. The emotional fracturing of my marriage was complete. There was no more hoping for a breakthrough. There was no more couples counseling or deep conversations to be had. The man who just drove away was a liability, and his family was a hostile entity attempting to seize my assets. From this exact second forward, I was no longer operating as a wife trying to save a relationship. I was operating as a homeowner protecting her territory. The tears he expected me to shed never came. Instead, I walked into my study, opened my laptop, and began drafting an extensive list of questions for the property and family lawyer I was meeting on Tuesday. Tuesday at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. I sat in a high-backed leather chair inside a heavily soundproofed office on the 40th floor of a downtown high-rise. Across the mahogany desk sat my father's recommended attorney, a man in his late 60s who possessed the sharp, entirely unsentimental demeanor of someone who dismantled broken marriages for a living. I did not cry. I did not vent about my mother-in-law or the dinners. I simply handed him my printed timeline, the deed to my townhouse, the limited liability company registration, and the commercial loan inquiry. He reviewed the documents in absolute silence for 15 minutes. When he finally looked up, his assessment was swift and clinical. He confirmed that because my home was purchased prior to the marriage, funded entirely by my independent accounts, and never legally commingled with Ryan's assets, my ownership was ironclad. The Harlan family had absolutely no legal leverage over my property. However, he warned me against acting rashly. He explicitly instructed me not to change the locks, pack Ryan's bags, or trigger an explosive domestic argument. Emotional outbursts were for amateurs. We were going to build a fortress of paperwork so impenetrable that by the time they realized they were locked out, the war would already be over. Following his precise instructions, my first offensive move was entirely administrative. I drafted a formal certified cease and desist letter addressed to Ryan and his father. I clearly stated that my residential property was not, and never would be, authorized for use as the registered address or principal place of business for their hospitality group. I mailed the physical copies via priority tracked shipping and simultaneously emailed the PDF versions to Ryan's corporate inbox and the North Carolina Secretary of State. I saved the delivery receipts in a new, securely encrypted folder on my hard drive. Next, I initiated a brutal, systematic separation of our shared existence. I spent Wednesday evening sitting cross-legged on my bed with my laptop, pulling 3 years of financial statements. I built a master spreadsheet. Column A tracked my sole income. Column B meticulously tracked every single mortgage payment, property tax installment, utility bill, and maintenance cost associated with the townhouse. I highlighted the origin of every single dollar, creating an undeniable paper trail proving that Ryan had contributed exactly 0% to the equity of the home. I then logged into our minor joint checking account, which we used exclusively for household groceries. I calculated the exact remaining balance, transferred my 50% share back into my private account, and disabled my overdraft protection link. I was financially amputating myself from the Harlan ecosystem. Thursday morning required defensive fortifications. I contacted the 3 major national credit bureaus and placed a hard security freeze on my Social Security number. No new accounts, loans, or credit lines could be opened without a complex, multi-step verification process that only I controlled. I did not stop there. I accessed the county clerk's digital portal and enrolled my property deed in a fraud alert monitoring program. If Ryan or his father attempted to quietly file a lien or use the house as collateral through some forged back-channel method, the county would immediately notify me, and the transaction would be blocked pending my physical, notarized presence. While I constructed my legal barricades, I drastically altered my communication strategy with Ryan. The silent treatment is an emotional reaction, and I was done being emotional. Instead, I adopted the sterile, impeccably polite tone of an automated corporate assistant. When he sent me long, meandering text messages trying to justify his actions or complaining about the tension in the house, I refused to engage with the substance of his guilt trips. I replied with short, declarative sentences. Acknowledged. We can discuss scheduling matters later. Please ensure the driveway is clear by 6 o'clock this evening. It drove him absolutely insane. Ryan was a manipulator who relied on my anger or my tears to create a dynamic where he could play the victim by offering him nothing but polite, icy compliance. I gave him nothing to push against. He was shadowboxing in the dark, completely unaware that the ring he was fighting in was rapidly shrinking. The most damning piece of evidence fell into my lap late Thursday night. I was in the home office, scanning some of my own work documents on our shared wireless printer. Out of sheer professional habit, I accessed the printer's internal administrative dashboard through my browser to clear the spooler history. I noticed a document scanned by Ryan's laptop 2 days prior, right before our explosive argument in the dining room. The file was titled Household Asset Summary. I downloaded the cached PDF and opened it. It was a customized financial declaration prepared for the commercial lending institution in Charlotte. My blood ran completely cold as I scrolled to the second page. There, listed under a heavily bolded section titled Family Residence Asset, was my townhouse. Ryan had included the current market value of my property to drastically artificially inflate his personal net worth, presenting a false image of immense financial stability to the bank. He had not just intended to ask me to sign the house away. He had already promised the lender that the house was essentially a family-controlled asset ready to be leveraged. He was wearing my financial independence like a costume to secure a bailout for a sinking ship. I immediately forwarded the PDF to my attorney. He called me less than 20 minutes later. His voice crackled with the distinct satisfaction of a lawyer who has just been handed the winning card. I asked him if I should print the document, walk downstairs, and throw it in Ryan's face. My lawyer told me absolutely not. He explained that if I confronted Ryan now, he would just invent another lie. He would claim it was a typo, a misunderstanding by the bank, or a draft he never meant to send. Let them dig the hole all the way to the bottom, my attorney advised. Do not interrupt an enemy who is making a fatal mistake. Let Ryan and his family bring their entire fraudulent proposal to you. Let them commit to the manipulation out loud, in a room together, fully believing they have cornered you. Then, we drop the hammer. I absorbed the strategy. It required a level of restraint I did not know I possessed, but the logic was flawless. Friday morning, I found Ryan in the kitchen. He looked haggard, nursing a cup of black coffee, clearly stressed by my icy detachment and the mounting pressure from his father's failing business. I walked over to the marble island, poured myself a cup of tea, and leaned against the counter. I looked at him, allowing my shoulders to drop, mimicking the posture of a woman who was tired of fighting. I have been thinking about everything you said, I told him, keeping my voice gentle, almost defeated. I hate this tension between us. I do not want to be the reason your family goes under. I am willing to listen. Ryan looked up, his eyes widening with a sudden, desperate flash of hope. Really? He asked, stepping closer. Yes, I replied smoothly. But I want everything out in the open. No more hiding things. Let us have one last dinner here at the house. Invite your parents. Invite Tyler and Megan. Invite Brenda. Tell them to bring all the paperwork and present their plan to me properly. If we are going to act like a family, let us sit down at the table like one. I offered him a small, soft smile. It was the exact same smile I had given his relatives on that very first night when I walked through the door. Ryan exhaled a massive sigh of relief, his posture instantly relaxing. He reached out and squeezed my arm, thanking me profusely, telling me he knew I would eventually understand. He walked out of the kitchen with a renewed spring in his step, already pulling his phone out to text his mother the good news. He genuinely thought he was winning. He thought he had successfully broken my boundaries and secured his prize. He had no idea I was simply inviting them to step onto a stage where the trapdoors were already rigged to open. The transformation in the house over the next 24 hours was nauseating to witness. Ryan moved through the rooms with the buoyant, arrogant energy of a man who believed he had successfully tamed a difficult horse. He spent Friday evening practically glued to his phone, typing furiously, a smug, relaxed smile plastered across his face. He had clearly broadcasted my supposed surrender to the entire Harlan network. The collective sigh of relief from his relatives practically radiated through the drywall. They thought the siege was over. They thought they had won. On Saturday morning, at exactly 10 o'clock, my phone rang. The caller identification displayed Lorraine. I took a slow, deep breath, cleared my throat, and answered. "Chloe, sweetheart," Lorraine crooned. Her voice was thick with an artificial, syrupy sweetness I had not heard since the week before our wedding. "Ryan told us the wonderful news. I am just so relieved. Every family has little misunderstandings, darling. It is just the stress of the modern world. But at the end of the day, we are a clan. We stick together." I held the phone slightly away from my ear, marveling at her ability to completely rewrite history. I agree, Lorraine, I replied, my voice smooth and perfectly agreeable. It is important that we all sit down and understand exactly what is happening. Exactly, she gushed, completely missing the double meaning of my words. We will see you tonight. Honey, I am making my famous potato salad. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the bed. They were already celebrating. The sheer, unadulterated confidence they had in their ability to manipulate me was staggering, but their arrogance was also incredibly sloppy. Because Ryan was so confident I was finally broken, he became careless with his digital footprint. He left his tablet unlocked on the kitchen island while he took a shower. I walked over, tapped the screen, and opened their family group chat. I scrolled through the messages from the past 12 hours. It was not a family conversation. It was a tactical briefing. They were literally assigning roles for the evening. Ryan's father had outlined the sequence of events. Tyler was instructed to deliver a speech about family sacrifice and legacy right after the main course. Brenda was tasked with complimenting my home and suggesting how perfect it would be for entertaining their prospective investors. Ryan was explicitly told to keep the wine flowing and present the final documents when I was sufficiently relaxed. But the most damning piece of intelligence did not come from Ryan's careless security. It came from Megan. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my phone chimed with a private message from my guilt-ridden sister-in-law. It was a photograph. The image showed a thick stack of legal documents resting on a dark wood table. Sitting dead center on the top page was a bright yellow sticky note, written in Ryan's familiar, hurried scrawl. It read, "Get Chloe to sign before dessert." Below the photo, Megan had typed a frantic warning. She explained that she had accidentally overheard Ryan and his father discussing their contingency plan. If I hesitated tonight, if I asked too many questions or requested more time to review the paperwork, the family was going to deploy their ultimate weapon. They were going to suggest, with profound, fake concern for my stressful career, that Lorraine temporarily move into my guest bedroom. Their stated reasoning would be to help manage the household, cook my meals, and host the business clients during the day, so I would not be burdened. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. They were not just trying to steal my equity, they were planning a physical occupation of my home. They wanted to install my mother-in-law as a warden in my own house, ensuring I was entirely suffocated by their presence until I signed the property away just to make them leave. The anger completely vanished, replaced by an executioner's calm. I did not cancel the dinner. I did not confront Ryan. I upgraded my strategy. I immediately contacted my attorney's office. I requested that the comprehensive packet of evidence we had prepared, the corporate filings, the loan inquiries, the fraudulent asset declarations, and the formal cease and desist orders be professionally bound and sealed in separate envelopes. I then hired a private, bonded courier service. I gave them highly specific instructions. The courier was to arrive at my front door at exactly 45 minutes past 7 o'clock that evening. Next, I walked into the living room. I turned on my large smart television and accessed the screen mirroring function. I connected my personal laptop, testing the wireless feed. I opened my encrypted file, displaying the digital timeline and the scanned documents in high definition across the 65-inch screen. The resolution was perfect. I disconnected the feed, leaving the television on standby, a silent, dark monitor waiting for its cue. For the rest of the afternoon, I played the role of the perfect, compliant hostess. I cleaned the townhouse from top to bottom. I vacuumed the rugs, polished the marble countertops, and lit the expensive lavender candles they all secretly despised. I set the long dining table with my absolute best items, the heavy silver flatware, the crystal wine glasses, and the thick linen napkins folded into precise, elegant squares. I spent 3 hours cooking a rich, complex beef bourguignon, filling the house with the incredibly inviting aroma of red wine, garlic, and slow-roasted meat. Ryan wandered into the kitchen around 5 o'clock, dressed in a sharp button-down shirt, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He leaned against the counter, inhaling the scent of the food. and smiled at me with genuine affection born entirely from the belief that I was finally submitting to his will. He poured himself a glass of water and told me how proud he was of me for being open-minded. I smiled back at him, my expression perfectly serene, and asked him to ensure the wine was decanted before his parents arrived. He eagerly complied, playing the role of the supportive partner, utterly oblivious to the intricate snare tightening around his ankles. At 6 o'clock, the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the polished hardwood floors. I stood alone in the center of my spotless kitchen. I smoothed my hands over the dark fabric of my dress. I listened to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. The doorbell rang. It was a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the silence. I did not flinch. The image of the first night flashed vividly in my mind. I remembered walking through the door, exhausted and defeated, finding them scattered across my furniture like invading conquerors, expecting me to serve them. I remembered the feeling of being a stranger in my own sanctuary. The doorbell rang a second time, followed by the muffled, cheerful voices of the Harlan clan gathering on my front porch. I took a deep, steadying breath. I walked slowly toward the front hall. I was no longer the tired, defensive wife trying to protect her peace from an overwhelming force. I was the architect of this entire evening. I was the director controlling the lighting, the script, and the final, devastating curtain call. I reached out, placed my hand on the cool brass of the doorknob, and prepared to welcome my guests into the trap. I swung the heavy oak front door open. Standing on my porch in the brisk evening air were exactly 6 people: Lorraine, Brenda, Tyler, Megan, Cousin Grant, and Uncle Arthur. It was the exact same cast of characters from that first intrusive evening, forming a perfect, symmetrical loop back to the beginning of this nightmare. But the underlying dynamics had entirely shifted. They flowed into the entryway on a tide of exaggerated affection and forced warmth. Tyler thrust an expensive bottle of imported red wine into my hands, clapping my shoulder a bit too hard. Brenda carried a massive, unnecessarily elaborate chocolate cake in a pink bakery box, cooing loudly about how much effort I had put into cleaning the house. Lorraine glided past me, her heavy floral perfume momentarily masking the rich aroma of the roasted beef I had spent 3 hours preparing. She did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. She walked directly into the dining room and claimed the center chair facing the large bay windows, arranging her posture like a monarch preparing to hold court. Ryan hovered around me like an anxious moth. He took the wine from my hands, his fingers lingering deliberately on my waist. He kissed my temple in full view of his mother and his brother. "My strong woman," Ryan announced to the room, his voice pitched perfectly to project deep admiration and solidify the narrative he had sold them all week. He wanted his family to see a united front, a partnership where the reluctant wife was finally and graciously stepping up to save the day. I let him touch my shoulder. I let him pull out my chair at the opposite end of the long wooden table from Lorraine. I played my part flawlessly, radiating a calm, compliant energy that completely disarmed them. We moved through the first course with mechanical precision. The clinking of heavy silver flatware against fine china punctuated the overly bright, rehearsed conversation. As I served the main dish, a complex beef bourguignon that required hours of simmering the atmosphere in the room distinctly shifted. The superficial pleasantries evaporated, quickly replaced by the orchestrated script they had coordinated in their digital group chat. Lorraine took a sip of her water, placed her crystal glass down with a soft click, and sighed dramatically. She launched into a carefully crafted monologue about the foundation of the Harlan legacy. She spoke with trembling emotion about the early days of their property business, the incredibly lean years, and how every single person sitting at this table had made profound, painful sacrifices to keep the ship afloat. "That is exactly what a real family does," Tyler chimed in right on cue, leaning forward and pointing his fork emphatically across the table. "We do not look at individual bank accounts or personal property when things get tight. We look at the collective pool. We protect our own people. We share the burden." I kept my expression entirely neutral, cutting a small piece of tender meat. It sounds like a very demanding situation, I remarked smoothly, looking up at Tyler. How long has the company been trying to restructure this current debt? I lobbed the question out gently, letting it float above the centerpiece. Ryan stiffened slightly beside me, clearly preferring I just listen in silence. But Arthur, eager to highlight their heroic struggle, answered immediately. Oh, we have been trying to bridge this specific cash flow gap since late last summer, Arthur declared solemnly, wiping his mouth with a thick linen napkin. The primary commercial lender started pushing back on our extensions around October. October. 7 months ago. Ryan had sworn to me just a few days prior that the financial crisis only materialized in the last 3 weeks. I nodded slowly, absorbing the massive discrepancy without a single change in my facial expression. It is a heavy administrative burden for Ryan to carry, I said softly, shifting my gaze directly to my mother-in-law. He has been managing so much of the corporate paperwork on his own. Well, he has had you to lean on, Lorraine replied smoothly, offering me a tight, predatory smile from across the table. Ryan told us how incredibly supportive you have been behind the scenes since January, reviewing the preliminary commercial loan applications for us. We know it has been stressful for you to juggle your demanding corporate job and our family filings. Chloe, we truly appreciate your silent partnership in this. January. Another massive lie exposed under the warm glow of the dining room chandelier. Ryan had told his family I was actively reviewing their loan applications 4 entire months before I even knew the shell company existed. I glanced over at Ryan. A thick bead of sweat had formed at his hairline. He gave me a wide-eyed, pleading look, silently begging me to just play along, to not correct the timeline, to let the delusion ride until the papers were signed. I smiled warmly at Lorraine. It is certainly a highly educational process, I replied politely. The wine flowed freely, rapidly loosening their tongues and inflating their collective confidence. They truly believed I was right on the precipice of signing the deed to my townhouse over to their failing enterprise. The suffocating tension of the past few weeks dissolved into a premature, arrogant victory lap. Then, the fatal slip occurred. Grant, who had been mostly silent while aggressively consuming the red wine, pointed a finger toward my custom marble island in the adjacent, open-concept kitchen. I have to say, Chloe, Grant slurred slightly, his booming voice cutting right through the soft background music. Brenda was totally right about the natural lighting in here. When the Chicago investors fly down to see the kitchen next month, this open layout is going to absolutely blow them away. It is the absolute perfect staging area for the hospitality pitch. The entire dining room froze. The silence that violently slammed down on the table was absolute and suffocating. Brenda dropped her heavy silver fork. It clattered loudly against her porcelain plate. Lorraine's eyes darted toward Grant with a look of pure, unadulterated venom. Tyler coughed awkwardly into his napkin, his face flushing dark red. Megan, who had warned me earlier, stared down at her lap, completely terrified. Next month, the Chicago investors. They had already scheduled a physical tour of my private property. They had booked flights and arranged corporate meetings in my living room, assuming the collateral transfer was a mere formality that Ryan would easily extract from me tonight. Ryan's face drained of all color, turning a sickly, ashen gray. He looked at me, sheer panic vibrating through his entire body. He opened his mouth, stammering frantically, trying to construct a safety net out of thin air. Chloe, he just means, hypothetically, if we ever decide to host a meeting. I held up a single hand. The gesture was small, but it instantly silenced him. I did not yell. I did not throw my crystal wine glass against the wall. The deep, satisfying thrill of absolute control washed over me, chilling my blood. The stage was perfectly set. The audience was seated. Their lies were completely exposed, and their monumental arrogance had led them straight to the absolute center of the trap. I think it is time for dessert, I announced. My voice was calm, perfectly clear, and completely devoid of warmth. I stood up, pushing my heavy wooden chair back against the floorboards. I walked slowly into the kitchen. I did not touch the pink bakery box containing Brenda's chocolate cake. Instead, I walked to the tall pantry, opened the wooden door, and retrieved the items I had carefully hidden on the top shelf that afternoon. I walked back into the dining room. Every single eye was locked onto me. The air was so thick with sudden, choking apprehension, it was difficult to breathe. I did not carry a cake. I carried a thick, heavy stack of crisp, white legal envelopes, each one meticulously labeled with a different name in bold black ink. Underneath the envelopes, I carried a massive, rigid black binder. I walked straight to the head of the table. I placed the black binder dead center, right next to the floral centerpiece. Then, I began dealing the envelopes across the polished wood like a dealer in a high-stakes casino. One for Lorraine, one for Brenda, one for Tyler, one for Arthur, one for Grant, and finally, the thickest envelope of all, dropping it directly in front of Ryan. I stood at the end of the table, looking at the 6 people who had tried to consume my life to fuel their own failures. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to stare down at the embossed legal seals on the envelopes. Then, I offered them the exact same polite, hollow smile I had given them on that very first night. I also prepared some paperwork, I said, my voice cutting through the suffocating tension like a steel blade. So we can all understand each other clearly. The heavy black binder hit the center of the dining table with a solid, authoritative thud. The sound instantly killed whatever lingering murmurs remained in the room. I flipped the thick plastic cover open. Inside, meticulously organized with color-coded tabs, was the complete anatomy of their deception. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the flat, precise cadence of a professional delivering a terminal diagnosis. "Please open your envelopes," I instructed. For a moment, nobody moved. The sheer gravitational pull of the binder had locked them in place. Then, Tyler, trying to project a facade of bored annoyance, tore his envelope open. The others slowly followed suit. The only sound in the room was the crisp rustle of heavy bond paper being unfolded. I watched their eyes scan the pages. I had curated the contents perfectly. Lorraine stared down at highly magnified, printed screenshots of the family group chat. Every single message detailing their tactical plan to overwhelm me, including the incredibly audacious contingency plan to move her into my guest room to monitor my kitchen, was highlighted in bright yellow ink. Brenda dropped her pages as if they were physically burning her hands. She had received side-by-side comparisons of the photographs she had sneakily taken of my dining room next to standard commercial real estate staging angles. Tyler and Arthur were currently digesting the official articles of organization from the Secretary of State, clearly showing my residential address fraudulently listed as the principal headquarters for Harlan Hospitality Group. "I am an underwriter," I stated, letting the words hang in the air above the roasted beef. "I evaluate risk, I verify assets, and I detect fraud. You all walked into my home assuming I was simply a stressed, oblivious wife you could steamroll with the concept of family unity. You were incorrect." I turned my gaze to Arthur. "I never consented to my home being used as a corporate registry. I have already filed a formal cease and desist order with the state, and the address has been flagged for fraudulent corporate activity." I shifted my eyes to Lorraine, who was currently clutching her pearls, her face drained of all its previous color. "I will never guarantee your commercial loan. I have placed hard security freezes on my credit and a fraud alert on my property deed. Any attempt to use this house as collateral will trigger an immediate federal investigation." Ryan slammed his hands flat on the table, the crystal water glasses rattling dangerously. He had to stop the momentum. He had to regain control of the narrative. "Chloe, stop this right now," Ryan commanded, his voice shaking with a potent mixture of rage and terror. "You are taking a few misunderstandings and twisting them into a conspiracy. We just phrased things poorly on the preliminary forms. It was just temporary administrative phrasing." "Phrasing?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. I reached into the binder and pulled out the single most destructive piece of paper I possessed. I slid it directly across the smooth oak table until it rested right in front of him. "This is the household asset summary you submitted to the commercial lender in Charlotte. I said. You explicitly listed my townhouse as a family-controlled residence. You artificially inflated your net worth using an asset you do not own, have never paid for, and have absolutely no legal claim to. That is not a misunderstanding. Ryan, that is textbook financial fraud. Ryan swallowed hard. His eyes darted frantically around the table, looking for a lifeline, looking for his mother to jump in and defend him. I just needed to show them we had backing, he stammered. I knew you would eventually agree to help. I was just preparing the groundwork so we would not lose the term sheet. You knew I would agree, I countered. I pulled out one final screenshot, holding it up so the entire table could read the enlarged text. This is a message you sent to your father 3 days ago. Quote, she will sign. Just prep the meeting schedule. End quote. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a carefully constructed illusion shattering into a million jagged pieces. The family did not look at me. They all turned their heads to look at Ryan. The dynamic shifted violently. He had not just lied to the bank, he had lied to his own accomplices. Megan, sitting quietly near the end of the table, finally spoke up. Her voice was trembling, but her words were clear. Ryan, you promised us she knew, Megan said, staring at her brother-in-law with deep disgust. You sat in our living room last month and swore to us that Chloe was completely on board, but just wanted to stay out of the legal details because of her job. You made us treat her like she was part of this plan. Lorraine's self-preservation instincts immediately kicked in. The matriarch, who had just spent an hour lecturing me about family unity, instantly threw her son under the bus to save herself from legal exposure. Ryan, Lorraine hissed, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at him. Did you forge these applications? Did you drag this entire family into a situation where we could be sued? You told your father you had handled the domestic side of this arrangement. I was trying to save the company, Ryan yelled back, his polished veneer completely gone, replaced by the panicked flailing of a cornered coward. You were the ones pushing me to find collateral. They began arguing bitterly amongst themselves. Brenda accused Tyler of moving too fast. Arthur yelled at Ryan for being sloppy. The united front had completely collapsed, turning into a circular firing squad right in the middle of my dining room. I did not intervene. I sat back in my chair and watched the fire burn. I let them scream and point fingers for exactly 3 minutes. Then, I stood up. You are all leaving, I announced. My voice was not loud, but the absolute authority in my tone cut through their bickering instantly. Right now, I looked directly at the man I had married. He looked broken, defeated, and entirely pathetic. My lawyer filed the formal separation papers this morning, I told Ryan, delivering the final, fatal blow to our marriage. The courier has already delivered your copy to your office. Under the guidance of my legal counsel, you have exactly 48 hours to pack your personal belongings and vacate this property. If you refuse, I will have the police escort you off the premises for trespassing. From this exact second forward, every single communication you have with me will go directly through my attorney. Nobody argued. There was no more gaslighting, no more manipulation, no more weaponized guilt. They had been utterly dismantled by a superior, entirely emotionless strategy. One by one, they stood up from the table. They did not touch the expensive wine. They did not look at the roasted beef. They silently gathered their coats from the hallway. Lorraine could not even meet my eyes as she scuttled out the front door into the cold night air. Tyler and Arthur followed, their shoulders slumped in defeat. Ryan was the last to leave. He stood in the open doorway, his car keys clutched tightly in his hand. He looked back at me, standing in the center of the brightly lit, perfectly clean hallway. He opened his mouth, perhaps to offer one final apology, or perhaps to hurl one last insult. He did neither. The absolute emptiness in my eyes stopped him cold. He turned around, walked out, and gently pulled the heavy oak door shut behind him. The lock clicked into place with a definitive, final snap. I stood alone in the quiet house. I listened to the sound of 6 car engines starting, backing out of my driveway, and fading away down the street. taking the chaos, the lies, and the crushing weight of their entitlement with them. I walked back into the dining room. I looked at the empty chairs and the stacks of legal evidence resting on the table. I smiled. It was the exact same smile I had worn on that very first night when I found them occupying my living room. But this time, it was not a polite mask designed to keep the peace. It was not a smile meant to comfort or appease anyone else. It was the genuine, deeply satisfying smile of a woman who had just surgically excised a cancer from her life, reclaimed her territory, and permanently secured the absolute right to dictate the terms of her own existence. Thank you so much for listening to my story today, and I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment below to chat and share your thoughts with us. Please subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.